Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be looking at this article called Why We Want to Go Out by Jenn der Bentson.
Okay.
And it's all about, kind of the motivations behind why some cross-dressers feel drawn to go out in public. And, at first that might seem a little paradoxical,
Yeah.
but I think what we learn here can teach us something about self-expression and acceptance, no matter who we are.
Sure, for sure.
So are you ready to kind of unpack this a little bit?
Absolutely. What I think is so interesting is this inherent tension the article highlights, right? Cross-dressing is often this deeply personal thing, even hidden for some.
Yeah.
But there's this simultaneous desire to actually express it publicly.
Yeah.
So what's driving that?
Right. And before we go any further, let's just be clear about what we mean by cross-dressing, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about expressing yourself through clothing that's typically associated with a different gender.
Right.
And it's important to note, this doesn't necessarily mean someone identifies as transgender. It's a really diverse experience with a whole spectrum of motivations and identities.
Exactly. And the article points out that this desire to go out, it's not about shock value or making a statement.
Yeah.
It's about something way more fundamental. The basic human need for self-expression.
There's actually research that shows how suppressing these core parts of your identity can lead to increased anxiety.
Oh, for sure.
And even depression.
Yeah.
It's almost like you're trying to hold a beach ball underwater.
Totally.
Eventually it's going to pop up with force.
It's going to come out.
Yeah, and Bentson captures this so well when she writes, it festers and bubbles below.
Yes.
You can almost feel that pressure building, can't you?
Absolutely. And, it's not just about the clothes themselves, is it? It's about expressing this authentic part of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Like, imagine having a passion for something like playing a musical instrument, but feeling like you could only do it in secret.
Yeah.
That constant hiding takes a toll, right?
For sure. Yeah. Totally. And then Bentson goes on to talk about this need to express themselves.
Yeah.
To stop being pushed aside and hidden. It's like this yearning to break free,
Yeah.
To not be confined by societal expectations.
Right. It reminds me of how other forms of self-expression, like tattoos or piercings, were once seen as so rebellious, but are now much more widely accepted.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we're constantly redefining what's normal.
Right. So we're really looking at cross-dressing within this larger context of social acceptance and evolving norms.
Precisely. And what's interesting is for many, the desire to go out isn't about wanting to be the center of attention.
Right.
It's about normalizing the experience, being able to do everyday things, going to the grocery store.
Right.
Meeting a friend for coffee without that fear of judgment.
The article really hits home on that point with this powerful anecdote where Bentson writes, the measure of if a crossdresser should be able to feel comfortable going to the grocery store should not be contingent on if they blend in so well as to fool everyone without question.
Wow, yeah, that's a powerful statement.
Right.
It really challenges us to think about our own biases, Yeah. Is someone dressing differently truly harmful?
Right.
I mean, where do we as a society draw the line between personal expression and what makes us uncomfortable?
Right.
Those are big questions.
Yeah. And let's be real. The article doesn't shy away from the fact that there are these real-world risks for cross-dressers who choose to go out publicly.
Yeah.
Right? There's the potential for judgment,
of course,
rejection, and maybe even professional consequences. It takes a lot of courage to face those possibilities.
Absolutely. And yet, despite those risks, the article boils this desire down to a very human need.
Yeah.
The desire for acceptance, to be seen and treated like anyone else, regardless of how we express ourselves.
Yeah.
It speaks to that universal longing for belonging and connection.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So if going out is about expressing an authentic self and seeking connection, why might some people struggle with this?
That's a great question.
Is it purely external pressure, or is there some kind of internal conflict at play too?
I think that's a great question, and it leads us to one of the most important aspects of this whole discussion.
Yeah.
The internal struggle that many cross-dressers face.
Okay.
It's not always easy to reconcile societal expectations with your own desire for self-expression, especially when it comes to something as personal as gender presentation.
All right, so we're starting to see the layers here.
Yeah.
It's not just about the clothes, it's about what they represent, the anxieties they might trigger, and this really fundamental desire for acceptance.
Exactly, and that's where things get even more interesting, because the desire to go out, it's not always straightforward. It's intertwined with this complex mix of internal and external factors.
Okay, I'm hooked. Let's dig into those complexities.
Yeah.
What are some of the internal factors that might influence a cross-dresser's decision to go out or not?
Okay, well, speaking of internal factors, the article mentions that a lot of crossdressers struggle with, feelings of shame or embarrassment,
Yeah.
especially if they've had to keep this part of themselves hidden for so long. It's like they've internalized society's disapproval,
Yeah.
and that can make it incredibly difficult to embrace and express that part of themselves openly.
So it's almost like they're battling two fronts, right?
Yes.
The external pressure from society
Yeah,
and this kind of internalized shame.
exactly. And that internal struggle can be really intense.
Yeah.
Imagine constantly feeling like you have to hide a fundamental part of who you are.
Right.
It can be exhausting and
Yeah.
emotionally draining.
Mm-hmm.
It can also make it really hard to develop a healthy sense of self-worth.
That makes sense. It's like if you're constantly told something about you is wrong or unacceptable, you start to believe it yourself.
Right, and that's why going out in public can be such a powerful act of self-affirmation.
Yeah.
It's a way of reclaiming your narrative,
Mm-hmm.
of saying, this is me, this is a part of who I am, and I'm not ashamed of it.
It's like a form of defiance, but not necessarily defiance against society, but rather defiance against that internalized shame.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
It's about reclaiming your power and refusing to let shame dictate how you live your life.
Right.
And sometimes that can be a really difficult and courageous step to take.
Absolutely. The article also touches on this idea that for some crossdressers, the desire to go out might be connected to a longing for validation or acceptance from others.
Sure.
Do you think that's always the primary motivator, or are there other factors at play?
It's definitely a factor for some, we all have this fundamental human need for connection and belonging, right?
Yeah.
And for someone who has maybe felt marginalized or different because of their identity, being able to express themselves openly and receive positive feedback from others can be incredibly affirming,
Right.
It can help to kind of chip away at those feelings of isolation and difference.
It's almost like breaking down these barriers of us versus them.
Right.
And recognizing our shared humanity.
Totally.
We all want to feel accepted and understood.
Absolutely. It's about fostering empathy and helping people see things from a different point of view and recognizing that our differences are what make us unique and interesting,
Right.
not something to be feared or ridiculed.
Yeah. Now, the article doesn't sugarcoat things. It acknowledges that there are very real risks
Oh, yeah.
involved in going out in public as a crossdresser.
Absolutely.
There's the potential for judgment, harassment, even violence.
Sure.
And yet, despite those risks, a lot of people still feel compelled to do it.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think drives that? What makes those risks worth taking?
I think that's a really important point.
Yeah.
And it speaks to the profound strength and resilience of the human spirit. When someone feels that deeply called to express themselves authentically, even in the face of adversity,
Yeah.
it's really a testament to the power of that inner drive,
It's about refusing to let fear control your life. It's about choosing to live on your own terms, even if it means facing, challenges or discomfort.
It makes you realize how much we take for granted, that simple act of going out in public
Right.
and feeling safe and comfortable.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to create a society where everyone feels safe and supported to express themselves authentically.
Right.
Because when people feel free to be themselves without fear of judgment or harm,
Right.
it benefits everyone.
Yeah, I think that's a key point here. It's not just about individual rights.
Oh.
It's about creating a more inclusive and compassionate society as a whole.
Absolutely. And, the article makes another interesting point, too.
Okay.
Not every crossdresser wants to go out in public, and that's perfectly okay, too.
Right.
There's no right or wrong way to express your identity.
The key is to find what feels authentic and comfortable for you.
Exactly.
For some people, that might mean expressing themselves freely in public spaces.
Right. For others, it might mean finding safe and supportive communities online,
Yeah.
or even just within their own homes.
Absolutely.
There's no one-size-fits-all approach to self-expression.
Exactly. It's about honoring your own journey
Yeah.
and finding what works best for you
Right.
and respecting the choices that others make for themselves.
Bentson brings up another point that I thought was really interesting.
Okay.
She talks about how the idea of passing as the opposite gender can actually be problematic for some crossdressers. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. The concept of passing implies that there's a right or wrong way
Yeah.
to express your gender identity,
Right.
and that you need to conform to certain societal expectations in order to be accepted.
Right.
This can create a lot of pressure and anxiety for people who don't necessarily fit neatly into those boxes.
It perpetuates this idea that there's only one correct way to be male or female.
Right.
And we know that's just not true.
Exactly. Gender is a spectrum, and people express their gender identity in a myriad of ways. Trying to force everyone into this rigid binary system is not only unrealistic, but also incredibly limiting.
Yeah.
And for some cross-dressers, the pressure to pass can feel like they're being forced to deny a part of themselves.
Right.
It's like they're being told, you can express this part of yourself, but only if you do it in a way that makes us comfortable.
Right. So instead of focusing on whether someone's passing or not, maybe we should be focusing on creating a society where people feel safe and accepted to express themselves authentically, regardless of how they choose to do so.
I think that's a wonderful goal to strive for.
Yeah.
A society where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued for who they truly are without having to conform to these narrow definitions of what's acceptable.
And that brings us back to this core theme of acceptance.
Yes.
Because ultimately, isn't that what it's all about?
Yeah.
Creating a world where people feel like they belong regardless of their gender identity expression or any other aspect of who they are.
That's beautifully said.
Yeah.
I think that's the sentiment we can all aspire to.
This has been such an insightful conversation.
It has.
It's amazing how one article can spark so many important questions
I know. It's incredible.
about identity, self-expression,
Yeah.
and the kind of world we want to create.
I agree. It's a reminder that these conversations are crucial,
Yeah.
even if they sometimes make us uncomfortable.
Right.
They push us to examine our own beliefs and biases and to consider different perspectives.
And sometimes that discomfort is a good thing.
Absolutely.
It means we're growing and learning.
It's a sign that we're opening our minds to new possibilities.
Well, for our listeners out there, what would you say is the most important takeaway from this deep dive into why we want to go out?
If I had to distill it down to one key takeaway, I think it would be this. Self-expression is a fundamental human need, and it can take many forms.
Yeah.
And when we create a society where people feel safe and supported to express themselves authentically, everyone benefits.
Right.
It's about celebrating our differences and recognizing that those differences make us richer and more vibrant as a society.
That's such a powerful message.
Yep.
It's about recognizing that diversity isn't something to be feared.
No.
It's something to be celebrated.
Exactly.
And it's a reminder that we all have a role to play in creating a more inclusive and accepting world.
Absolutely. And sometimes that role might simply involve listening to someone's story, trying to understand their perspective, and treating them with dignity and respect.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'd like to leave our listeners with a final thought.
Okay.
If the desire for self-expression is truly universal, as this article suggests, how can we each, in our own ways, contribute to a world where that desire is met with understanding and acceptance rather than judgment and fear? Something to ponder, folks.
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it? About how we can all be more mindful and create spaces where people feel comfortable expressing themselves authentically. For sure, and sometimes that starts with challenging our own assumptions about what's normal or acceptable, you know?
Like, where did those ideas even come from?
Exactly.
And who benefits from keeping those narrow definitions in place?
Right.
It's like those rules were never really meant to help anyone, just to control people.
It's interesting, isn't it, how these seemingly simple things like what we choose to wear
Right.
can become so loaded with, you know, social and cultural meaning.
Yeah, it's like clothing becomes a language, and sometimes we're not even aware of what we're communicating
Right.
or how it might be interpreted by others.
Exactly. And for people who are expressing their gender identity in a way that doesn't align with those traditional expectations,
Yeah.
that language can be even more complex and fraught with potential misunderstanding.
Which is why these conversations are so important.
Absolutely.
The more we talk about these things openly and honestly,
Yeah.
the more we can break down those barriers of fear and judgment.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah. Knowledge is power, and understanding is the key to empathy.
So true.
Huh?
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to thank you for joining us
Oh, thank you.
and for sharing your insights on this complex and important topic.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a real eye-opener for sure.
I always enjoy these deep dives, and I hope our listeners found it thought-provoking.
Yeah, and for those of you listening, we'd love to hear your thoughts, what resonated with you,
Yeah.
what questions came up for you. Join the conversation on our social media channels, and let's keep this dialogue going. Thanks for diving deep with us.